Born in Czechoslovakia in 1939, Brych painted himself as a refugee from communism who happened to have a medical degree. New Zealand opened the door to the stateless Brych in 1968, and he began serving a probationary period required by overseas registered doctors, beginning with a job as a lab technician at Auckland Hospital. He then worked in pathology before being appointed as the Registrar of Pathology. It was in the Auckland Hospital Library Brych began researching experimental cancer treatments. Having now gained his medical ticket, took his cancer treatment studies to the next step, using oncology patients as his guinea pigs. The diminutive 20-a-day smoker and oftenly flamboyantly dressed Brych soon established himself as the top dog in Ward 11 at Auckland Hospital. To grasp how Brych had managed to establish a mini serfdom within New Zealand's largest hospital in the early 70s, we need to now look at the state of the nationwide medicine at the time. Then, a diagnosis of cancer was seen as a death sentence. Underfunded, the New Zealand state system failed patients in terms of options. Chemotherapy was a rarity, and the potential of immunology some way off. Milan Brych offered hope at the time, when for many, there wasn't a lot of options except to get your state of affairs in order. Only that hope was false. The master of self-publicity, he appeared to have the research and a cure others didn't. The unquestioning press largely doted over him. His treatment, he claimed, was a world first, and any detractors were jealous professional rivals or his inferior. And detractors he did have. In particular, John Scott, who became Sir John Scott, in the Department of Medicine. His questionable practices, unwillingness to divulge the nature of this treatment, soon attracted the rancour of his peers and bosses as well. A public inquiry was set up, in the background of which Brich's supporters subjected those behind the inquiry to intimidation. Scott received death threats, mock bombs placed in his letterbox, and even had his daughter's Christmas presents destroyed in a break-in. The police began having to monitor his house 24/7. The independent Judge Wright saw through Brich's circumvention, calling him a fibber. Brych was struck off, a decision he appealed. The process took some time, close to 3 years, during which Brych was permitted to practice pending a decision. Next stop, the Auckland Adventist Hospital, before opening a Brych Oncology Centre in Remuera, which ran until 1977. Treatment at his clinic there came at a hefty price, ranging from $10,000 to $40,000, when the average house price in New Zealand at the time was $25,000. This was about the time a rather large skeleton Brych had kept hidden in his closet came to light. As part of the medical review into Brych, Professor John Scott travelled to Czechoslovakia to check him out. Scott was suspicious of Brich's treatment from the go. During Scott's trip behind the Iron Curtain, he discovered Brych had no medical qualifications at all. In another bombshell, he also found out that the very time he said he was studying for his medical degree, Brych was actually inside jail for robbery and violence. Not the first time he had done time in his homeland either. He had first gone inside prison aged 17. The claims about all his medical paperwork having been lost were nothing but barefaced lies. That was apart from his Czechoslovakian thesis, which, belatedly translated, turned out to be little more than text roted from medical books. Also now in his case was his one-time defence lawyer, Kevin Ryan, who happened to be on the Auckland Hospital board as well. All throughout his time treating patients, Brych had refused to divulge what exactly the ingredients of his potion were. He had differing excuses why he couldn't reveal his secret cure.
The mafia had threatened to kill me if I revealed it to anyone else. I have Big Pharma just waiting in the wings. I was in the process of shifting to Finland, and the new employers had made me sign a contract of confidentiality.
His drug now, though, did have a name. Kevin Ryan set out to find more. In the end, this wasn't that hard. Those were the days there were library cards. You signed out for books and anyone could see who the previous readers were. Ryan found the very book Brych had based his entire treatment on. The disturbing part of this was the British treatment was tried and discredited. High doses of steroids could achieve good initial results, a reprieve to patients. However, the vast majority of patients would die within approximately 2 years. Of greater concern was that some would die within days of the first dose. Conventional treatments like chemotherapy, now the standard practice, had a higher success rate in the medium to long term. That was why this treatment he was using was no longer employed anywhere else in the world, except now for Auckland. To prove his medical credentials, the medical board asked him to complete a paper on his wonder drug, one that would involve a blind trial of his treatment versus the conventional to assess its efficacy. He now refused to do so on the basis, i.e. he had a new excuse, and it wouldn't be fair on the patients that got the conventional treatment and not his. Auckland hospital authorities, though, already had the historic patient records of Brich's patients to now run a comparison. The result of the study is in front of you, and bear in mind those days the older results was not at a time when there was chemotherapy. Brych was exposed as a charlatan who preyed on the vulnerable to line his own pockets. Struck off and unable to practice in New Zealand, Brych now headed for Rarotonga in April 1977, a welcome guest of the then Prime Minister Sir Albert Henry, setting up his own clinic in the National Hospital, peddling the same lies to mostly desperate New Zealand and Australians, lured in with claims of an 80% success rate. He was the victim of a New Zealand witch hunt. His treatment would be proven just by the results. All this despite everyone now knowing he wasn't in fact a doctor. Desperate patients began flying in, and this quote from one best sums up their desperation. His clinic suddenly closed its doors in August the following year, leaving a cemetery there, which is now called, even today, the Brickyard. Rumours have it some of the dead, those without relatives on the island at the time they died, had their bodies dumped into the Pacific. His continued use of high doses of steroids meant some patients died within a week of landing in the country. A quick segue here, people. One of Brich's patients, about to become a victim, was the modern-day Robinson Crusoe, Tom Neal, who spent decades in isolation on a remote island north of Rarotonga. That island, or islands, has an intriguing history, including pirates and treasure. Link to the video I've done on that in the description. Next, Australia was on Brich's radar. There or thereabouts, he tried knocking on the door of Joe Bjelke-Petersen, the Premier of Queensland, who was personally happy to let him start up a clinic in that state. No one else was, though. Scott had also heard the rumours and done a cook's tour, pre-alerting the powers that be and the Australian public alike that Brych was nothing but a conman. The Australian media ripped into his credibility, pointing out his lack of medical qualifications as well as his sordid past, telling him literally to his face, "You are a charlatan, mate." The Queensland Cancer Society, doctors in the oncology wards, didn't believe in the credibility of his magical formula or the cure rate either, one that was based on nothing more than apricot kernels. Brych was chased out of Australia. The lights and deep pockets of Bel Air in California beckoned. There he could be seen driving a Rolls Royce to and from his swimming-pooled mansion. He had a horse ranch in Arizona. For 4 years he ran a cancer clinic out of the offices of an orthopaedic surgeon, all without a licence. Brych even treated the surgeon he cohabitated with. He died later, by the way. Amongst the notables he claimed to have treated and cured from his Beverly Hill clinic were actress Jacqueline Bisset, famed heart surgeon Christian Barnard, First Lady Betty Ford, and even Nelson Rockefeller. Those were but a small sample of the references he presented at his trial in 1983. None of them, by the way, had entered his clinic. So Brych finally ended up in court, somewhere in the planet, when the Californian Board of Medical Quality Assurance sent a healthy undercover agent into his clinic feigning symptoms. Brych did tests and diagnosed him with cancer and left him with a quote for $60,000 to cure it, when the average wage in the US at the time was $25,000 a year. Gotcha! He was up for 52 charges of overt acts. The sting also took a look at the makeup of his magical cure. That turned out to be a low dose of chemotherapy mixed with steroids. After a 7-month trial, Brych was sentenced to 6 years in jail. The judge hit the nail on the head by describing him as a callous, devious human being. 3 years later, he was released on good behaviour, though, letting the world to know he had spent his time in jail productively. His study in the slammer had allowed him to design a new revolutionary drug to treat cancer, only he was now running out of places to practice. Where to next? At this point, the trail went many ways. Brych had begun using a number of aliases to mask his trail of destruction. Here are some of the places his name or names post-USA crop up. You can take your pick. Tahiti, Australia, Switzerland, London. A New Zealand doco-drama entitled Cancer Man that came out in 2012 said they had tracked him down to Oxford just outside London. Yep, that's New Zealand on your screen, and it's probably a good bet to start off with, seeing when he was deported from the United States, immigration there would have put him on the first plane back to New Zealand. Brych was, after all, a stateless refugee when he arrived in New Zealand in 1968, and it's reasonable to presume he carried the much-cherished Kiwi passport to roam the planet. In short, no one really knows where he is today and whether he is even still alive. From a Kiwi's perspective, this was a tale of ineptitude on a grand scale. It started the day Foreign Affairs officials allowed the 4-time convicted criminal to enter the country. A public hospital allowed a layman to practice medicine based simply on the word, "I've lost the relevant paperwork." Cripes, Brych wasn't even good at forging a CV. The 2 universities he claimed to have studied at were both misspelt. These are institutions the public should have faith in. Add to this list of incompetents the Medical Board and the Ministry of Health. Whilst they were dilly-dallying, Brych was stripping away life savings. In one case, literally a farm was sold to fund his false treatment. Add to this the gullible media who did negligible research into Brych and focused on his brief wins and never his increasing losses. One of the saddest things I located on the internet related to Brych is a Facebook page dedicated to the poor souls exploited in Rarotonga and now buried in Brickwork Cemetery. Let me encapsulate his time in the cooks with this one photo. 5-year-old Jared Nutt from Adelaide, who died in the arms of his parents Sonia and John 2 days before Christmas 1977. It was official doom in New Zealand that should never have allowed a deviant narcissist like Brych to get as far as he did. Happy to see the back of him to Rarotonga, fully conversant of the misery he would reap there. The first trial for malpractice and justice should have occurred in New Zealand. It didn't. Yes, ultimately there was a review into what was termed the Brych affair. Too late, too little for his victims and their loved ones. What it found out, amongst other things, was that the Auckland hospital were scared that patients treated by this unqualified quack would now sue the hospital, addressing this possibility first rather than being focused on the medical outcomes of the patients. A cynic would also suggest the only reason the government acted alongside the medical board was they too feared being sued. And the Brych affair also made it patently obvious anyone with enough legal firepower could overwhelm the medical council, tie them in knots for years. In the end, none of Brich's New Zealand victims saw justice. This could in some way, of course, be addressed by the New Zealand government even today, almost 50 years later, by stripping him of his New Zealand passport. Before I sign off, don't forget to take a peek at the Suwarrow Treasure Island. It's a great adventure story and one of my personal favourites. Your subscription to my channel would be greatly appreciated. Small creators on this platform are being squeezed out by YouTube's algorithm. Please be sure to support every independent channel you go to by subscribing. I'll see you next time.